I believe that infertility is the most striking aspect of modernity, and I also believe that it will be the defining factor of the 21st century. However, it still remains a complete mystery that cannot be reduced to a single factor. To approach this topic, I think that it would be interesting to imagine a scenario. The central idea is this. One day, the entire population of the world simply disappears, with the exception of your country, which now finds itself in an empty world. The question is, what would be the social response to this event, and how would it affect the fertility of your country? Let's get into it. In a strictly biological sense, mass infertility is quite bizarre. Which other species have problems with reproduction? Bacteria certainly seem to do fine. Rats have at it with little difficulty, and most other pre-modern human societies have also had little trouble when it comes to making children. Indeed, you and I are both the result of thousands of successive generations since we started being Homo sapiens, and many more millions before that, leading up to the first living organism. When we put this into context, we realize how much of an outlier our modern societies are. This is a recurring debate topic in my friend group, since many of them believe that this is, at worst, an economic inconvenience, and at best, a nothing burger. However, I am very much convinced that this is a civilization-defining phenomenon. Certainly, if there existed an uncurable viral disease that killed 40% of all newborns while they were still in their mother's arms, we would not be so nonchalant. However, the end demographic result, both of this hypothetical disease and a TFR of 1.2 children per woman, which is what Italy and Japan have, would be the exact same: a society without youth and a society without a future. Indeed, if we adjusted the mortality rate of our baby-killing disease to match the fertility rate of South Korea, we would have a disease with a mortality rate of 67%. By having a TFR of 0.70, this means that each new generation will be approximately 33% the size of the previous generation. The only difference in this comparison is that in our hypothetical epidemic, this demographic decimation will be involuntary, while in our reality, the disappearance of youth is completely voluntary, and as a result, there is no panic. South Koreans aren't stupid, though. They know what's going to happen to their country. That's why they have spent over $200 billion since 2006 to incentivize their young adults into having children, with no visible success. If we assume that all current fertility trends stay stable, by the time that I will die around 2080, South Korea will have a total population of 24 million, a reduction of over 50% from their peak of 52 million in 2020 in just a period of 60 years. Not to mention that most of these 24 million people would also be approaching the end of their lives. Approximately 45 to 50% of the population would be over 65 years old. It would not be an exaggeration to say that such countries are in the slow process of dying. Can we imagine a modern city like Seoul with less than half of its current population? A city made of steel, glass, and concrete where only half of all apartments are inhabited, with thousands of abandoned businesses, restaurants, and strip malls, all glimmers of a past prosperity. In short, it would be a ghost city that would put Pripyat to shame. Interestingly, while I was still editing this essay, Kurzgesagt uploaded a video on the future demographic collapse of South Korea, if you want some animated statistics. This situation is actually not very different in other parts of the world, such as Europe. For example, the population projection for Italy in 2080 is for the population to shrink by 1/3. But perhaps the most shocking statistic is the total number of children in the 0 to 5 age bracket today as compared to 1970. In 1970, there were 4.5 million. Today, it's less than 2. Today, there are 56% less young people in Italy than 50 years ago. Let us not forget that they will soon have to pay for the retirements of those age brackets over twice their size. However, the great trouble with all of these demographic trends is that they cannot simply be reduced to a single measurable factor that explains everything. There are many indicators that also correlate with low fertility, such as rate of urbanization and the percentage of women with a formal education. However, the issue is that none of these correlations implies a direct causality, because there are many exceptions to each one of these cases. This leads me to believe that although economic factors are important, that fertility is more a direct consequence of cultural and social factors that are not easily measured. In order to talk about some of these social and cultural and frankly personal factors, I think that a thought experiment could be interesting. You're free to imagine this scenario with your own country. Let's imagine that one day the population of Italy wakes up, has their morning espresso, and prepares for another day's work. However, something is off. There is complete radio silence outside of the peninsula. Nobody picks up the phone in any other country, and the internet activity of all the world suddenly stopped in the middle of the night. As time passes, it becomes evident that the entire population of the world outside of Italy has simply vanished into thin air. They are alone now, and the world is theirs. What would be the consequences of such a cataclysm for Italian society, and what would happen to their birth rate? If it remains unchanged and the citizens of the Repubblica continue their lives exactly as before, with the exact same miserable TFR of 1.2, then humanity will become extinct in a matter of a couple centuries as their population shrinks and shrinks further into an evolutionary bottleneck. However, this scenario seems unlikely in my opinion. I believe that if any country finds itself alone in the world, there would be a great drive towards repopulation of the world and the expansion of their borders into the vast uninhabited continents with their empty cities. In short, I think that the current birth rate would sharply increase. I believe that this rise in fertility would not be very pronounced if the entire world suddenly sank into the ocean, with the exception of Italy. In this scenario, there would be no unclaimed land to expand into, and it would just be the same old Italy with endless oceans around it. Of course, we could never know how each society could react to such a drastic change. However, speculation is exactly what is interesting here. The rest of this essay will be how I approach this scenario from 3 different angles and why I think that infertility would end in the empty world scenario. 1. The resource thesis. One of the first explanations for a possible spike in birth rates is that, in this world, the population of Italy could enjoy near limitless resources for at least a couple hundred years. Every young person now struggling to buy a house could just move into one of the millions of abandoned homes around the world. The same would go for cars and every single other sought-after item. And let's not forget about raw materials. Vast Arabian and Venezuelan oil reserves are just sitting there. In short, the first few generations would enjoy a very high standard of living after the economic shock of the first few months. Surely this would increase the standard of living and move people towards having a larger number of children that they desire without the anxiety of not being able to afford their own home and the expenses, of course, that come with having more children. This thesis has a very clear internal logic. However, the strange thing is that it does not correlate very well with real-world data. At a national level, the correlation between standard of living, being HDI or GDP per capita, and fertility is clearly very negative. So this data would suggest that having more resources generally does not incentivize family formation. However, it has to be said that it is not that simple as simply money equals infertility. There are many outliers in this graph alone. There are relatively poor countries that have a sub-replacement birth rate, such as India or Jamaica, and of course Ukraine. And on the other hand, there are exceptions, such as Israel and Kazakhstan and many of the oil states. However, their numbers have been declining rapidly. Another interesting aspect of the resource thesis is class. There are remarkably different fertility rates when one looks at income brackets. One can observe a U-shaped curve with both the lowest income brackets and upper earners having a higher fertility rate as compared to the middle class households. So here one can observe that the relationship of income and fertility is beyond complex, and the correlations often seem to contradict themselves. Rich countries tend to have almost no children, but inside these societies, the richest individuals have more than the middle classes. This implies that there are social dynamics that go beyond just economic considerations. For example, the middle classes desire upper social mobility. This is universally true. In this case, a child for an aspiring professional can be a huge liability. On the other hand, both the very poor and the very rich are less concerned with social mobility and will not hesitate to have an extra child. One could infer that the social pressures and class dynamics might be more influential than just the material reality of a couple. One extreme example of this is, of course, South Korea, where there are insane pressures on young people to succeed in education and move up the social ladder by getting a job at one of the mega corporations in the country. Here is a very good article about that. I think that in our thought experiment, the sudden availability of resources might facilitate the aspirations of many young people. However, I think that it is also certain that wealth does not directly equal fertility. 2. The manifest destiny thesis. An interesting angle of this thought experiment is that repopulation and colonization of the empty world would be something that would give a national sense of meaning to a country. In this case, many would come to believe that it is Italy's destiny to repopulate the world and to bring civilization back into the deserted world. When the main motivation to have children is simply personal fulfillment, then having children becomes just another life project, not unlike your career, your romantic relationships, or your painting hobby. Indeed, there are millions of people who decide consciously not to have children because they prefer to dedicate their energy and their time to other life projects that will give them fulfillment without countless sleepless nights and 20 years of daily work. If children are personal projects, having few of them is the rational choice. That way you will still have time and money for painting or your corporate career. In my own personal experience, this is the biggest reason why Zoomers and Millennials say that they would rather not have any kids. One can certainly argue that the nations that place a high emphasis on everyone seeking their own individual fulfillment while having no national purpose are infertile. The few exceptions to the trend of infertile rich countries are the countries that do have a sense of national and collective purpose. In the case of Israel, they feel that they are in a constant state of siege and that their neighbors would love nothing more than to destroy them. This, together with the fact that their enemies have a rapidly growing population, means that the Israelis are in a demographic arms race against both their Arab neighbors and their own Arab citizens. If they lag behind, it could mean military defeat and demographic replacement in just a couple of decades. Another example is Kazakhstan. Their national mission might get a lot less attention than the Israeli case, but it is perhaps even more interesting. The Kazakhs were reduced to a minority in their own country during the first decades of the USSR. They suffered a famine in the 30s, which is very, very surprising, and the migration of millions of Slavic settlers and forced deportees eventually made up the majority of the population. Their nadir was in 1959, where the census reported that the Kazakhs only made up 30% of the population of their SSR. However, today they make up over 70%. This was a result of their significantly higher fertility rates as compared to the Russians, combined with large migrations of Slavs following the dissolution of the USSR. It is no exaggeration to say that Kazakhstan has been experiencing both a cultural and a national revival. They have both a young population and a growing economy, so they seem to be headed into a good century. I think that Kazakhstan provides a really interesting case study because their national cause was to repopulate their own lands. We could imagine a similar motivation existing in our thought experiment. The people of Italy could see themselves as the only survivors of the human race, and therefore they would feel a collective responsibility to repopulate the earth with other attractive Italians. This hypothetical situation would probably also lead to a cultural revival and a sense of manifest destiny. However, I believe that it would also be incorrect to come to the conclusion that nationalism equals fertility. Certainly, the South Koreans wish to preserve Korean culture and society. Indeed, they are generally very patriotic, but this has certainly not translated itself into a sustainable birth rate so that their culture might continue into the future. The proper conclusion is that countries with high fertility rates tend also to have a strong sense of collective purpose. 3. The owned space thesis. I believe that the biggest reason why fertility would increase would simply be that there would suddenly be a vast amount of uninhabited and unclaimed territory for Italy to expand into. The idea of unowned and unclaimed space is almost a foreign concept to us modern people. The idea of an unexplored frontier is something for our imagination only. We've already settled every continent and photographed every island. Only space itself remains unknown and unclaimed. However, we are not technologically advanced enough to explore and colonize space, if this is even a possibility. However, we are naturally drawn towards expansion and discovery, an instinct that today is sedated through digital means, primarily through video games and fantasy. Indeed, I believe that the satisfaction of asserting one's will on unclaimed space is the primary reason why Minecraft has become the most successful video game of all time, far outcompeting more complex games with better graphics. I would personally speculate that when given enough unclaimed territory, any society would see it as their mission to explore and to claim this new land, and that this would of course awaken a great amount of energy. Not unlike the energy unleashed when a caged bird is allowed to rove the skies for the first time. Bronze Age Pervert writes heavily about the relationship between a healthy life and the process of seeking out and then owning space. Quote, "Struggle for space. A healthy animal, not under duress, not maimed, not trapped by man, seeks first, when young, space. Animals seek space in physical sense, territory. But this meaning isn't crudely physical. Generally, you must take it to mean something else. Space to develop inborn powers. Monkey that lives in trees seeks skills to master canopy. Beaver seeks ownership of river and banks and reeds in its grasp. All this is higher organism organizing itself to master matter in surrounding space. Successful mastery of this matter leads to development of inborn powers and flourishing of organism. Organisms seek mastery of space, environment, and to master matter in ways particular to its own abilities. And as a result of this mastery of matter, there is a development of the body, of its senses, and of all its faculties, and the unfolding of its inborn destined form or nature. As for reproduction, animal and natural state will not even seek at this point, will not even think about it. Very far from its aims, it seeks to become strong, skillful, to master problems, and to feel the expansion of its powers. Only after the development of its powers and its mastery over space specific to its needs does the need or desire for reproduction come. Reproduction is side effect of animal desire for discharge of strength, after mastery over space is achieved. For this reason, many lower animals breed very fast and in great hurry, but the higher and more organized the form of life, the more complex its needs for development are. The longer is delayed the time of reproduction, and the more vulnerable it is to the stresses of competition for survival. The struggle for ownership of space is the path that governs higher life. Survival and reproduction are only side effects of this path." End quote. This argument offers an explanation of the incredibly low birth rates that are found in the developed world, where individuals have limited space to expand into, and where their life trajectory leads them away from ownership and mastery of space and into an office cubicle. Although this is certainly more comfortable than living as a hunter-gatherer, can we really say that 30 years of office life produces the perfect specimen, the pinnacle of human development? If we accept the thesis that higher life forms have to develop themselves by conquering and mastering the space around them, and that they must do this in order to then look towards reproduction, is it any surprise that infertility is the norm? We have spent our entire youth in classrooms learning useless trivialities that we have long since forgotten, in order to get a degree so that we can enjoy the privilege of working in offices that look like liminal spaces, so that we can earn enough money to consume more products, until one day we die. Indeed, if there is no unclaimed space for the individual to claim during his life, this instinct will become frustrated, and this will lead to much restlessness. It is my belief that much of the bitterness that people feel against modernity comes from this very frustration, that we were all raised with stories of heroism and adventure, of superheroes, magic, and great quests. But how can adventure exist in a world where nothing is unknown? Or how can heroism exist without danger? The stark contrast between our fantasies and our real lives creates a great amount of resentment and a chronic feeling of disappointment. The feeling that our lives could be so much more than our commute to work, that we are going to miss out on the great adventure that our lives could have been. However, as previously mentioned, to have an adventure one needs some unclaimed space to explore and to master. But in a world where everything has already been claimed, the only way to acquire space is to expand into the space of another, resulting in war. However, our societies have been deeply traumatized by the wars of the 20th century. Therefore, the only way to live in the end of history, to avoid war and social conflict, is to constrain the will to claim and conquer space. A big part of this is not to encourage fertility. A country with a growing population, a country with a young population, has the will to expand and the capacity to do so. For example, the nations that fought in the Great War were exceedingly youthful and energetic. Their populations were literally itching for war, and when it was declared, millions of young men volunteered, and indeed, the women were no less energetic. Is it any surprise that the Israelis and the Palestinians are constantly at each other's throats, given that their populations are young, energetic, and they are competing for the same space? On the other hand, an aging population without this will to power will be able to have both inner and outer peace. However, the price of this peace is the repression of the instinct to master space, and the result is infertility. The issue at hand is that there is no such thing as free lunch. Each type of age structure will have its own problems. A society that is young and energetic will see conflict and war to claim ownership of space, and one that is old and tired will repress this instinct, spiritually castrating their youth and resulting in infertility. That is why I think that this thought experiment is so interesting. It offers the possibility to claim space without conflict, and as a result, I believe that the people living in the empty world scenario would become fertile once again to claim the world. My own conclusion is that this scenario opens up the larger question of what constitutes a proper environment for human nature to develop itself and to flourish. But frankly, that is such a large question that it goes way outside the frame of this small essay. But I do encourage you, my dear reader, or listener in this case, to ponder the question even if it is utopian in nature. If you have your own theory of what would happen in the empty world scenario, I would be glad to read about it in the comments. As for me, I'm headed off to Italy to fix this on my own.